So you're director of the UNDP's crisis response unit. What was the idea behind setting up this unit?
The CRU?
And what exactly does this unit do?
Yeah, as you know, UNDP is obviously a development cooperation organization. But if you look at the world around, there are so many crises. So we have to make sure that we become, or we are, UNDP is a development cooperation organization that can also respond to crisis properly and fast in the required speed. And our strength is that we can actually, if we can respond really quickly to crisis, then we can, from the start, we can actually put the perspectives of early recovery and also resilience. So we can actually become, much more strategic in the way that international community can actually respond to crisis. So that's, you hear this terminology of fit for purpose. The UN organizations need to change with the changing environment and the context. So, that was the sort of reasoning behind this rather dramatic restructuring of the UNDP. And as one of the outcomes, it's not the only one, but as one of the outcomes, this new entity called Crisis Response Unit. So what we do is to basically make sure that UNDP actually takes a whole of UNDP approach. And the crisis response perspectives and early recovery perspectives are integrated into everything that we do in development work. So our role is to make sure that by becoming a sort of crisis coordinator, making sure that different parts of UNDP will be responding collectively so that we actually take the whole of UNDP approach. And of course, we have the more concrete work that we have to do in terms of sending people. I mean, right now I have been, when all these things are happening with the conference and different meetings, regularly updated on the situations in the Pacific with the cyclone Pam. So I had to actually generate people already so that they will be able to go into the country Vanuatu as soon as the airport is opened. So we actually bring different parts of the organizations to be able to respond together and very fast. So that's sort of so in a way, crisis coordinator, crisis manager, working with other parts of UNDP, and that's the role of our unit. I should also emphasize that it's not just natural disaster context. I mean, in fact, if you look at the number of victims of humanitarian crisis, actually 70-80% are in a conflict setting. And it's much more complicated to respond to that sort of crisis. So we have the crisis portfolio and also the natural disaster crisis.
So disaster risk reduction is one component of your activities?
Well, risk reduction perspective, again, has to be integrated into everything that we do. In other words, the whole development actions will have to be risk informed. So, all parts of UNDP is actually integrating that perspectives. So it's not just, my little unit, that coordinates and manages the crisis response, but there's a large sort of a team that is specifically looking at how to mainstream this DRR perspectives into everything that UNDP does. It's not just the crisis context, but it has to be part of a normal development work as well. I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? If you can actually invest in DRR, then you don't actually have to spend so much money after the crisis to feed the population, from humanitarian interventions. So we think it makes sense to integrate and mainstream these DRR perspectives throughout the development process.
But how does the cooperation with other UN organizations function in this case?
Well, obviously we have to work together because a lot of the risk reduction part is actually to for example, create national sort of legal frameworks on the ground in different countries. Needs to have very good disaster management law. for example. So we've been working quite a lot in I think 70-80% of our program countries. UNDP has been part of preparing that legislative framework to properly actually invest in DRR. But also, UN is relatively good at preparing the legal frameworks, but that's only a beginning of the work. We have to then, from the legal framework, we have to then create the actual capacities at the country level, so that these legislation will actually have an impact in terms of DRR.
And that's more difficult.
Well, it's difficult. It's not. I wouldn't say it's difficult. It takes time because it's about the capacity building. And for that to happen, actually, we need to have good partners on the ground that are engaged with those stakeholders. I mean, I was meeting with the Secretary General of the Federation of Red Cross Societies, and they have a huge strength because they are they have national chapters. It's the national committees that will actually be implementing those things in terms of capacity building, etc. I mean, we have been partnering with them also in terms of preparing the legislation as well. But the next step is actually to create capacities on the ground. So we're doing a lot of that, and we think it makes sense to invest in that type of activities. So, I mean, we can't prevent disasters. That is not possible. But if we can minimize the risk, then we can minimize the impact, and therefore probably much smaller humanitarian interventions. So the whole international support will probably become much more sustainable.
Now, the disaster-prone countries, they lack funds. They also lack technologies. So, which means these have to come from the rich and industrialized countries. So, isn't that a problem?
Well, yes, of course, and I think that's why the governments are now, the delegates are now discussing. Japan just pledged, I think, $4 billion during this conference. So there are, goodwill, but it's not just about, the amount of money. I mean, ODA pledges, X billion USD. That's probably not going to be enough. As I said, I think that, there will have to be a sort of understanding on the part of all governments that they have to invest in building DRR frameworks. They have to invest in building resilience and ensuring that resilience. So it's also about how you spend that money as well. It's not just the amount of money, but how you would like to spend it.
That's the old debates, the effectiveness of development assistance.
That's right.
Because sometimes one tends to hide behind that to justify not to be in a position to get the money because the effectivity is not there, which by itself is a complex issue.
Yes. Yeah. I think there is emerging noise. I mean, obviously, because 2015, this year is a critical year, especially, on the eve of Addis. Many countries are now looking at what it is that they will have to agree in Addis. Sendai is the first one. I mean, we, for UNDP, these 4 different big forum actually are one big process, and they have to be before
Good segments.
Yeah.
So what would you suggest? The vulnerable sections, marginalized sections of the world, what could they expect from these, from Sustainable Development Goals, and from COP21?
Well, I mean, let's hope that these intergovernmental processes will produce strong enough policy framework that will actually fully recognize that these are, in fact, the DRR is development concerns, so it will be treated as such, and also that the countries will understand that you need to actually make investments in resilience and risk reduction. But also I think it's, for UNDP, it is also very important that these policy frameworks will not just be a policy framework in abstract, if you will. It has to be, or they have to be something that can be implemented in a very concrete way. on the ground at the country level. And obviously UNDP is in the lead in terms of we're the largest organization that have been implementing those things. And we've invested $2 billion in the past 10 years in this area of DRR. So,
$2 billion.
Yeah. So, in terms of the implementation capacity, we are the one who will have to actually take those policy frameworks, look at them, and then reflect them into our country programs. So our work actually will probably much more, intense when these frameworks are ready. We have to take them and then, operationalize them, if you will. So those are the hopes. Of course, these are all intergovernmental processes. We're here to support the governments and inform, in our view, what works and what doesn't work that well. Feeding that perspectives into government delegations in the form of advice.
Do you also have that possibility in working with the media? Tell the media what works?
Yes, we have been repeating these messages throughout. Helen's extremely good at that. She has been repeating this, and hopefully, the countries are beginning to really understand our messages. In fact, I said 4, but there's another one in the middle of next year. That's the World Humanitarian Summit. So for us, it's actually continuing until then, because we can't just say to the development actors. Humanitarians will also have to understand that life-saving approach only is not going to be sustainable. There are too many crises around the world. The world cannot just continue feeding the population. There have to be a greater, better capacity, resilience, so that those countries and communities and people themselves will be able to respond to their crisis by mitigating the risks, etc. So humanitarians also need to understand that life-saving approach only is not going to be sustainable much longer. There's just simply too many crises.
But then we're entering here the minefield, where it's a question of what does international cooperation achieve? It doesn't. The lack of balance between the rich and the poor, the big gaps which exist. We come back again to the ODA, its relevance, and these responsibilities of national governments, what they can do.
Yeah, I think the national governments also have a huge responsibility, but that's why we work with the government. We are the partners, largest partner of those governments, especially in DRR areas. We have been, I talked about disaster management laws in different countries, and that's a prime example of governments taking their responsibilities and then creating the capacities to make sure that these legislative framework will actually have an impact. We work with them also. So government responsibilities and our support actually go, they are, both sides of the same coin.